Today, the YMCA movement says that it is for all. This is a bold statement that I hope all listeners heartily endorse. What have we, as an institution, had to go through to get to this point? And what lessons can our movement learn from that journey that will inspire us to continue to seek out the all and for all? Who is included under the banner of all? Hello, my name is Ryan Bean, and I'm an archivist at the Couts Family YMCA Archives, located at the University of Minnesota. At the Archives, our mission is to preserve the heritage of the YMCA movement and to connect scholars, students, and most importantly, YMCA professionals to the heritage of the YMCA through education and outreach. My favorite way to share that heritage of the Y is by sharing stories drawn from our collective legacy. The quest to be for all is one story I'd like to share with you today. This story starts at the beginning. The year is 1844 and George Williams and a group of like-minded men joined forces to create the Young Men's Christian Association, an organization designed to protect an individual from the sin and vice of Victorian London. One of the most precious documents at the archives is the first report of the London YMCA. It is our birth certificate and describes a society that was created for the improvement of the moral and spiritual condition of young men engaged in the drapery, which was basically retail, and other trades. We can learn a great deal about who the Y was for in 1844. Women were obviously not allowed, nor were old men, and young boys. In fact, the organization was even limited by social class. It was for the drapers, or other similar trades. This was not a laborers' organization, and it was not for the poor. There is a group that the Y was for, and they were not necessarily explicit in calling for their participation. You see, one thing I have learned by looking at the history is when an organization like the Y is a product of the dominant culture, there are inherent assumptions as to who is and who is not included. So in 1844, the YMCA was for all white evangelical Protestant men. However, as any student of history knows, this story is not so straightforward. During this era, many Christian faiths were splintering along doctrinal, political, and ideological lines. George Williams and his colleagues created an inclusive community when they declared that they did not care which Protestant evangelical faith you came from. It was your character that mattered. What mattered to them was what your faith compelled you to do. This may seem rather narrow to us today, however it was radical back then, and it was also a line that George Williams had to defend regularly, when invariably a doctrinal debate would erupt amongst the members about whether to hold a certain belief or position as a requisite for membership. George Williams would reply with, "How does that help us win men?" And so you can see from the very beginning, the YMCA partake in the very human tradition of simultaneously inviting and excluding, sometimes explicit and sometimes not, but always seeking for new communities. As soon as the YMCA arrived on American soil, it spread rapidly. In a few short years, there were dozens of YMCAs organized in the U.S. One of those YMCAs was the Washington, D.C. YMCA for African Americans, organized by Anthony Bowen, a freed slave. What is important about this story is not that the YMCA was segregated, and so Bowen and his friends organized a Y of their own. America was segregated, and there were very few opportunities for diverse groups to interact. What is fascinating is that Bowen and his friends saw power and opportunity in the YMCA movement in its goal of improving the moral and spiritual condition. They could have organized themselves into any group, but chose the YMCA. This is one of the first nudges towards truly being for all. The next turning point is the First World War. Up to this point, the YMCA had begun to make a name for itself as an innovator and community advocate. Associations across the country were pioneering youth work, physical education, trade schools, and work with immigrants. The YMCA was now providing services to an increasingly broad array of individuals, but its membership and organizational identity was still affiliated with mainline Protestantism, and active voting membership was still reserved for men of a Protestant faith. The YMCA may have entered its war service as a Protestant organization, but its service to millions of men, women, and children across the globe reshaped the organization into a community benefit. The YMCA responded to this crisis with never-before-seen energy, adaptability, and clarity of purpose. Literally overnight, the YMCA remade itself, increasing the size of its staff fivefold to nearly 26,000 men and women, and engaged itself in any form of service where there was a need. Education, entertainment, health and welfare, recreation, transportation, and nutrition. The war forced the Y to embark on a chart of work fundamentally different from its traditional domestic efforts. This quest to serve all clashed with the foundational evangelistic nature of the YMCA, which, unlike the war work, was not without motive. These experiences created a need for a post-war re-examination of the objectives, methods, and structures of the YMCA. The re-examination of the post-war years culminated in a national convention held in Cleveland, Ohio in 1931. The increasingly secular nature of YMCA work necessitated a rolling back of the requirement enacted in 1868, which limited voting membership to men who were active in an evangelical faith. This decision allowed Catholics to join the boards of YMCAs and was an acknowledgement of an increasingly common reality that many local YMCAs were already doing so. The exclusionary policies were softened even more 2 years later, when an additional policy was adopted that allowed local Ys to choose for themselves the qualifications for voting membership, so long as the boards agree with the purpose, ideals, and spirit of the YMCA. 1946 was a significant year for diversity in the YMCA. Ahead of their times, that year the National YMCA closed the Colored Work Department after passing a resolution banning discrimination based on race. They also urged local associations to desegregate as well. This was 8 years before the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education ruling that challenged the notion of separate but equal. This policy was adopted at local levels with varying degrees of enthusiasm, and over the next 40 years, the national office convened a variety of programs and committees to advance interracial work within the YMCA. While there remained many pockets of inaction and discrimination within the YMCA, there were also many successes as a result of this work, and we can be proud of this bold stance taken by our predecessors. 20 years later, racial discrimination in the YMCA was formally banned. A year later, the Black and Non-White YMCA Secretaries Conference, or BANWYS, was formed to hold the movement accountable. BANWYS was, in many ways, a predecessor to the emerging multicultural leadership experience. In 1968, they held their first conference, which was organized by Leo Marsh and others, to tackle systemic discrimination within the YMCA head-on. The theme of the conference was Confronting Racism in the YMCA. The Time is Now. In his report on the conference, Mr. Marsh commented, "The YMCA movement itself will benefit as it responds to the mandate of the Atlanta Conference." Marsh acknowledged that the work already performed by the National Board and some local Ys in improving race relations, declaring that a goal of the conference was to make the Y more relevant in what was happening in the world. BANWYS and Emily are important examples of the movement holding itself accountable. At any point, these individuals, like Bowen, could have decided to leave the YMCA. The goal of BANWYS was more than an attempt to change the YMCA. Rather, the aspirations of the conference can be interpreted as compelling the YMCA movement to be true to its ideals and founding principles. The YMCA is always evolving. Early on, boys and men were allowed to join, different racial and ethnic groups had their own Ys, and eventually were included in the broader movement. And participation in particular faith traditions was no longer a requirement to participate and serve. And 134 years after its founding, the YMCA movement was finally able to rise above its foundational narrow view of who fit into all. In 1978, women were officially welcomed into the movement. Many YMCAs had long benefited from female participation, but others resisted their inclusion. This would no longer be allowed, and as women formally entered the Y, new communities were invited in rapid succession. The civil rights and women's rights movements ushered in an age of identifying diversity. New groups began to demand to be recognized and given a voice and equal opportunity. And as our nation's laws codified their participation, they were added to the list of groups the Y does not discriminate against. But looking at this statement from 2002, how many more commas can we add? At what point does it say that at the Y, we do not discriminate, period? That point is now. This is an exciting time for the Y. The world is changing so quickly, and this statement embraces this change. We may not know who will make up the future groups, but we do know, based on our history, that the YMCA has space for them, and that the YMCA is stronger for their participation. When the Young Men's Christian Association was founded, society was highly stratified. As the barriers between groups softened and faded, the YMCA movement was quick to greet them. We can learn from these and other past examples. The struggle to be truly for all provides a framework for identifying, engaging, and uplifting today's underserved and marginalized communities. Communities who are waiting for their invitation to be part of all.